She wrote with petals, whispered with ribbons, and wielded flowers like sharpened words. In a city where beauty can be bought by the stem, one woman's silent language became deadly. When a boy is found strangled with a bouquet in his bag and a note addressed to Nero Wolfe, what blooms isn't grief, but revelation. Behind every blossom lies a secret, and someone willing to kill to keep it buried. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. There's a certain kind of Manhattan party where the wine's too dry, the laughs are too loose, and the guests are a little too careful about pretending not to watch one another. Lily Rowan, bless her chilled elegance, knew how to throw that kind of party without looking like she was trying. So I was leaning against a fluted column in her penthouse, holding a glass of something French and effervescent, and pretending to listen to a man in socks more expensive than my whole suit, when a woman I didn't know touched my arm. She had the look of someone who arranged centerpieces for a living, pale, compact, and overly composed, but her voice cracked at the edges like old cellophane. "Excuse me," she said, "I was told you work with Mr. Nero Wolfe?" I gave her my best cocktail party smile. "When he lets me. I'm Finanella Marsh. Coral Downs hasn't come to the shop in 2 days. She's never done that, never without a call." It didn't strike me as particularly lethal, not then. Finanella Marsh, I soon learned, was the assistant floral designer at a boutique called Blooms and Benedictions down in Soho, the kind of shop where the roses don't have thorns and the receipts come on linen paper. Her boss, Coral Downs, was the name on the door, and according to Finanella, the only one with keys to both the front lock and the private cooler. The shop had been dark for 2 days, no deliveries, no calls, no Coral. I listened, nodded, and mentally filed the whole matter in the thick drawer, labelled "People do odd things." New Yorkers vanish all the time, into jazz bars, weekend houses, other people's apartments. This didn't smell like murder. It smelled like overripe orchids and freelance panic. "Maybe she's just gone to a spa," I suggested. "With a man and a hangover." Finanella didn't laugh. She looked down into her empty glass as if it might whisper reassurance. "She's not that kind of woman." That was, of course, precisely what people always said right before someone turned out to be exactly that kind of woman. The hook didn't set until she said Wolfe's name. "She had an appointment with Mr. Wolfe," Finanella murmured. "Something about an orchid hybrid. She was going to bring him a sample stem. She mentioned it last week." That lifted my eyebrows above the rim of my glass. Wolfe didn't often entertain commercial vendors, but he made the occasional exception for plants, poetry, or cheeses with challenging passports. If Coral had arranged to bring him a hybrid, it meant one of 2 things. Either she had something genuinely rare on her hands, or she'd managed to flatter his horticultural pride with surgical precision. "And she didn't show?" I asked. Number I checked. He never saw her. I made a small, thoughtful sound and put my glass down. Wolfe didn't like to be stood up by anyone, but he especially disliked being stood up by people who promised orchids. It offended his sense of botanical etiquette. "Miss Marsh," I said, "I don't promise anything, but I'll mention it to him." "He probably won't care." She swallowed hard. "That's what I'm afraid of." Wolfe was in his chair when I got back, which was not news, as he'd been in it since 9 a.m., reading a monograph on Masdevallia species and sipping beer from a chilled glass that would sweat less than he did. When I mentioned the missed appointment, he closed the book, but not his mind. "Coral Downs?" he said, tasting the name like it might contain sulphur. "Yes, a florist, allegedly reputable." She requested an examination of her specimen, but I declined to encourage her commercial aspirations. I agreed to inspect the stem as a courtesy only. "Well," I said, "she hasn't been seen in 2 days. Her assistant's worried. The shop's locked." He gave me the long, slow blink of a man enduring ignorance as a daily condition. Then perhaps she has met someone richer and more gullible. So that's it? It is a lapse, he said, returning to his book. Not a felony. Do not waste my time with petals. Some days I don't know if he's the smartest man in New York or just the most stubborn. You get to know certain expressions when you sit across from them often enough. Finanella Marsh hadn't asked me for help. Not really. She'd simply unburdened herself like a woman unwrapping flowers she wasn't sure she should have bought. But it was the way her eyes flicked to the side, or how her hand trembled slightly when she reached for her glass again. Those were things you don't learn from books. She wasn't worried Coral had left town. She was afraid Coral had done something, or had something done to her that would land both of them in a shadow they couldn't name. And I'll say this, Wolfe doesn't always need prompting. He smells fear better than cigars, but sometimes he chooses not to name it until it arrives with headlines. So I decided I'd go poke around the shop, not for Wolfe, not for Finanella, mostly for that itch at the base of the skull that says, something's off. Soho was trying too hard as usual, gallery windows, overpriced espresso, and the scent of cedar-scented money. Blooms and benedictions sat at the edge of the more tasteful blocks, a squat shop front with beveled glass, lettering in gold, and a white curtain pulled slightly askew from inside. The door was locked. I rattled it anyway. Through the pane, I could see the display had been left half-finished, a brass stand with no card, a bowl of peonies losing heart. But it was the single rose that made me stop. It floated in a tall crystal vase near the window. Limp, neck bowed, petals browned at the edges. The water beneath it had turned the colour of forgotten tea. No one had changed it. No one had come near. You don't leave a rose like that unless you mean to abandon it. I didn't have a warrant or a locksmith, so I didn't go in. Not yet. But I memorized that window the way you memorize a name on a gravestone when you don't know if it's going to matter. Spoiler, it mattered. There are absences that make sense, a cab that didn't arrive, a call that got lost, a door you forgot to lock. And then there are absences like this one, where everything that should be there is intact, but the air feels thinned out around the edges. That rose, the droop of it, the murky vase, the fact that no one had touched it in 2 days, told me more than any alarm bell ever could. Coral Downs wasn't out shopping for rare orchids. She wasn't sipping cocktails with a lover in Montauk. She'd gone missing with the kind of deliberation you don't choose for yourself. I waited another few minutes, watching the street. Nothing. The building was silent, the blinds unmoving. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe would still be ignoring the world. But something told me this world was about to knock harder than he liked. I stepped back from the window, hands in my pockets, the day getting colder behind my collar. If someone had removed Coral Downs, they'd done it carefully, maybe even beautifully, the kind of disappearance you arrange. She arrived at 11:30 sharp, which for Wolfe is acceptable, and for me was early enough to delay lunch prep without complaint. I opened the door myself since Fritz was out shopping, and Miss Finanella Marsh walked in with the precise gait of someone who wasn't sure if she was expected, but had decided to come anyway. She was carrying a purse too large for her frame and too rigid for comfort, and she clutched it like a woman hiding either a weapon or a confession. Her hands, I noticed, trembled, not with theatrical effect, but with the kind of fine, disciplined restraint that comes when you're trying hard not to embarrass yourself. She followed me into the office without asking, which told me she'd rehearsed it, and when Wolfe inclined his head exactly 3/4 of an inch from his chair, she set the envelope down on his desk as if it were both a plea and a challenge. "I don't have much," she said quietly, "but it's enough for a retainer." Wolfe did not glance at the envelope. He looked at her instead, deeply, silently, and said, "Miss Marsh, sincerity is an overrated currency. Let us speak of facts. If there's a sound I know better than the rattle of a revolver, it's the audible grind of Wolfe's tolerance being dragged across a carpet of human emotion. Fenella Marsh, with her trembling sincerity and her envelope full of small bills, was not the kind of case he welcomed. But there were two levers she had unknowingly leaned on, the offence of a missed orchid consultation and my presence, arms folded, observing his response. "You say," Wolfe began, his eyes half-lidded, "that Miss Downs has vanished, that the shop is unattended, that you believe something untoward has occurred." Fenella nodded once. "She wouldn't just disappear." Wolfe sighed through his nose. "Most people do, Miss Marsh, but very few vanish. Vanishing implies effort, deception, perhaps artistry." I cleared my throat. "She didn't show up for her appointment here. That's not a misdemeanor." Wolfe's gaze flicked to me, then back to Fenella. "Very well. I shall consider the matter, temporarily, subject to the arrival of data more compelling than a florist's silence." And just like that, we were in. "Coral was," Fenella began, choosing each word like it was a flower being placed in a vase, precise. "She didn't design arrangements. She composed them. She said every bouquet should say something a client couldn't say aloud." Wolfe grunted. "Nonsense. Flowers say nothing. People assign them meaning so they may avoid clarity." "She believed in codes," Fenella replied. "That tulips in odd numbers expressed regret. That delphinium meant distrust. If a woman asked for red roses for an anniversary, coral would suggest something else entirely. Subtle, intentional." Wolfe raised his brows a fraction. "So she was not merely a florist. She fancied herself a medium." Fenella coloured slightly, but pressed on. "Some of her clients expected that. Politicians' wives, theatre directors, people who needed to say things without leaving fingerprints." It was my turn to interject. "And did she keep records of these compositions?" Fenella hesitated. "Only in her own notes. She kept a private ledger, symbolic shorthand." Wolfe gave a small, unpleasant smile. "Then your Coral Downs dealt in influence, private meanings with public consequence. A dangerous occupation." Fenella lowered her eyes. "She said the wrong bouquet could end a friendship, or a marriage, or a life." Wolfe murmured. "Let us hope not." I asked for names, and Fenella delivered them with the precision of someone mentally sorting each into columns of loyalty and danger. "Howard Emory is the shop manager," she said. "He and Coral were engaged once, but she broke it off a year ago. He stayed on, said he needed the work. But they barely spoke unless it was about deliveries or billing." "Why remain in such proximity?" Wolfe asked. Fenella shrugged. "She said he was harmless. I'm not sure she believed that." "And the boy?" "Toby Quinn, 19, works part-time, delivers arrangements on a bicycle, knows more than he should. He was always near the phone when Coral made her private calls." "And yourself?" I asked. She hesitated. "I handled the aesthetic details, placement, color balancing. I never touched the client ledger." Wolfe folded his fingers across his stomach. A triangle of proximity, resentment, and curiosity. Efficient. "Mr. Goodwin, you will begin with Emory and the boy." Fenella looked down again. "They were loyal, I think." Wolfe's voice was dry. "Loyalty, Miss Marsh, is not a shield. It is often a motive." And with that, the first circle of the arrangement took form, just fragrant enough to conceal the poison beneath. Names are like seeds. You don't toss them around unless you're prepared to watch what grows. So when I asked Fenella if Coral had anyone in her life who didn't show up in the yellow pages, she hesitated the way a woman does when she's about to say something that can't be unsaid. "Bernard Valdon," she murmured. "They were involved." "Define involved." Fenella's gaze slid off mine and landed on Wolfe's paperweight. "He came to the shop almost daily last spring. She stopped using his name around us in July." That was a name I knew. Bernard Valdon wasn't just another silk-suited heir with a yacht and a tailor on retainer. He was a minor celebrity in certain circles, the kind where people throw parties for their dogs and cry in foreign languages. More relevantly, he was also the son of Harcourt Valdon, whose shipping firm could float a war. Any idea why it ended? She said he stopped writing. but she didn't say it like someone abandoned, more like someone outmaneuvered. Wolfe spoke at last. A woman whose livelihood depends on coded messages is seldom confused by silence. The question is not why he left, it is what he left her holding. I don't often chase ghosts through Manhattan's classier neighborhoods, but Gramercy Park has a way of dressing its dead in cashmere. I spent the better part of an afternoon mapping Coral Downs' last known movements, which narrowed to a tight private appointment in the east wing of the Valdon family mansion. The staff, such as they were, knew better than to talk to strangers with notebooks. But a doorman across the street recalled a woman answering Coral's description entering the side entrance 4 nights ago. No one had seen her leave. The trouble with the rich is they have more doors than alibis. And while I've never been shy about knocking, there are doors in this town that don't open for anything short of fire or scandal. The Valdon estate was one of them. I returned to the brownstone with a page of tight notes, a sharper suspicion, and the distinct sense that Coral's silence hadn't been voluntary. Wolfe skimmed the page, frowned, and said, "A disappearance within a fortress suggests either collusion or burial." Which wasn't comforting, but then Wolfe doesn't do comfort. He does facts. We'd seen Finanella to the door, me, not Wolfe, who rarely escorts anything but plates, and I was halfway down the steps when she stopped suddenly, her gloved hand tightening on the railing like the memory had grabbed her first. "There's something else," she said, voice low. I waited. Coral told me someone came to the shop, late, just before she vanished. Who? I don't know. She didn't say. Just someone she'd once loved, someone she thought she knew. And? She said he came to end something. She looked at me, haunted. But it didn't sound like a breakup. It never does when you're still hoping for a second act. I didn't press. Not there. Not with her eyes already clouded by a storm she hadn't named. But I filed it the way Wolfe files letters he pretends not to reread, quietly, thoroughly. Back upstairs, Wolfe hadn't moved. He never does when he thinks the truth is still circling the perimeter. But when I told him what Finanella had said, he closed his eyes for half a second longer than usual, which, with Wolfe, is the equivalent of a thunderclap. Bernard Valdon opened the door himself, which would have surprised me more if I hadn't already known his staff had the discretion of a dead butler. He was wearing a silk dressing gown in a shade of coral that would have made most men look like a blushing corpse, but on him it passed as theatrical elegance. The apartment behind him was a curated gallery of inherited taste, antique Burmese carvings, ash-grey velvet, and the faint scent of something French and obscure. He gave me a smile that said he'd dealt with sharper men and hadn't bled yet. "You're Mr. Goodwin, yes?" I expected someone taller. "You were misinformed," I said, stepping in. "I'm here about Coral Downs." His smile didn't flicker, but his shoulders stiffened like silk doesn't. I gathered. "May I offer you something Campari, perhaps?" "I'm working." "Then you must be thirsty." He poured himself a glass and didn't offer again. I didn't sit. "She was last seen 4 days ago. You were close, recently not." "We were fond acquaintances," he said, sipping. She preferred discretion. I honored that. I didn't say what I was thinking. That people who insist on discretion tend to leave fingerprints in the wrong places. For a man schooled in misdirection, Bernard Valdon had a tell. He looked down, not away. So when I mentioned Coral's assistant being worried, he looked away. But when I said Coral hadn't shown up to her appointment with Wolfe, he looked down, a small, controlled flinch that wouldn't have made the evening news, but might have made Wolfe arch an eyebrow. "And she didn't leave a note?" he asked lightly, adjusting the crystal tumbler on the tray, like it needed alignment. "She didn't leave anything. Not even letters?" I took a step closer, just enough to let the air shift. "Letters?" He caught himself, too quickly. "I only meant she was a romantic. She enjoyed handwriting." "Did you send her any?" "I did." A pause. She didn't reply. "Did she threaten to?" His jaw worked, but the smile returned. "I think we're done, Mr. Goodwin." "Not quite." but I let it sit. Sometimes a lie needs to marinate before it floats. Howard Emory met me at the shop door with the same expression I'd seen on men who'd misplaced their dignity somewhere between ambition and rent. The place still smelled faintly of lavender and refrigeration, though the cooler was off. He wore a wrinkled apron and a shirt that had once been starched. "She's not dead," he said before I could speak. "She needed time." "That your guess or your prayer?" He looked away. "Coral wasn't easy. She expected precision, demanded it. You arranged 2 stems half an inch off, and she'd treat you like you broke a vase over her cat." "You're still working here?" "I need the job." "And the key?" She took the only set. "Locked it from the outside. I've been entering through the rear." "That's romantic," I said. "When was the last time you saw her?" He hesitated. 3 days ago. She said she had an errand, didn't say where. I didn't buy it. He had the tremor of a man rewriting a conversation after the audience left. Toby Quinn was the delivery boy, though he had the attitude of a drummer and the haircut of a Greenwich poet. He met me behind the shop, 1 foot on a pedal, cigarette tucked behind one ear like punctuation waiting for a sentence. "Coral was weird that week," he said, chewing gum like it owed him rent. "Jumpy, kept looking at her planner like it was talking back." "Did she say anything to you?" He shrugged. "Mostly snapped, but I caught her on the phone, speaking French, real fast, mad." "You speak French?" "No, but my mom does. She said Coral was calling someone a traitor." "Any idea who?" "Nope, but she burned the note she wrote right after." "What kind of note?" "White card, blue ribbon, the kind she only used for, personal ones." He didn't need to say more. Wolfe had already mentioned Coral's preference for coded messages, and Toby, for all his slouch, had been watching closer than anyone thought. You can always count on someone watching through their curtains, and in Soho, the curtains tend to be linen and judgmental. The neighbour I spoke to was a music teacher with tight lips and tighter opinions. She hadn't liked Coral, said the woman was private to the point of rudeness. But she remembered the crate. "It was late," she said. "Around 11. I saw someone wheeling a long Florist's box out the back. Couldn't see their face. Too dark. They loaded it into a van." "Was Coral with them?" "Number just the box. Long, wooden, handled with gloves." "Unusual?" "Not for that shop. They had weird arrangements." "Anything else?" "There was a smell," she said. "Not flowers, something sour." She closed her window then, physically and conversationally. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but it was enough to raise a wolf-sized eyebrow when I got back. A crate, gloves, and a smell not belonging to lilies. It didn't take a genius to connect the missing with the removed. Back behind Blooms and Benedictions, the alley was narrow, damp, and cluttered with the kind of refuse that tells you more about a business than its brochures. A florist's trash isn't just petals and paper, it's forgotten intentions. I saw it right away, half concealed behind a rusting steel bin, a long wooden crate, splintered at the edge, stained along one seam like it had been dragged through a memory and dropped. No label, no ribbon, just a faint scuff of blue at one corner. I lifted the lid. Inside was nothing except a strip of cloth, pale, torn, and edged in lace. I touched it with a pen. The stain was unmistakable. Blood, dried to a dull brown, the color of regret that's had time to settle. I didn't move it. I just stood there a minute, listening to the silence of a story someone had tried to discard. When I returned to the street, the city felt a little less crowded. Back at the brownstone, I placed the cloth in a sealed envelope and locked it in Wolfe's desk drawer. I didn't tell him right away. I waited until he'd finished dinner. Some facts deserve a clean palate. I waited until the coffee was poured, until Wolfe had completed his ritual of folding the napkin across his lap and uttered his brief pre-dessert sigh. Then I told him. His spoon paused mid-air. "You are certain?" "As sure as I've ever been. The crate, the cloth, the stain. If that wasn't Coral's blouse, it was a damned good forgery." Wolfe put the spoon down and closed his eyes, not in grief or prayer, but in concentration. When he opened them again, he didn't look at me. "There is a quality to silence," he said softly, "that changes with death. It becomes a space, not merely an absence. Coral Downs is no longer silent. She has been silenced." I said nothing. That's a line you don't cross, not with Wolfe. He leaned back, fingers steepled. "We must presume this is no longer a search, but a reconstruction." "Of what?" "Of motive," he said, "of timing, and of a truth she held which proved intolerable to someone too proud, too desperate, or too frightened." He closed his eyes again. "She is no longer merely missing, Mr. Goodwin." And there it was. Not thunder, not drama, just the quiet, undeniable weight of a murder being acknowledged. Inspector Kramer came in like February wind, sharp, wet, and without an invitation. The scent of the East River preceded him by a yard and lingered behind longer than courtesy would dictate. He didn't bother with greetings. "She's turned up," he said, eyes on Wolfe, voice low and sour. "Wrapped in burlap, floral netting, weighted with brick. East River, near Pier 37. Wolfe looked up from the Orchid Review as if the interruption had come from a passing squirrel. "Who?" "Coral Downs." Kramer dropped a folder onto the corner of the desk with the care of a man placing a bomb he no longer had patience for. I took it. The pages were damp at the edges, and the ink still smelled like municipal failure. Coral had been missing for 5 days. Now she was accounted for. "She didn't drown," Kramer added. "Strangled, cord around the throat, dumped like cargo." Wolfe shut the magazine. "That," he said, "is an obscenity. Not for the violence, but for the symbolism." Kramer snorted. "We're not chasing metaphors, we're chasing a murderer." "Yes," Wolfe replied quietly. "But in this case, the metaphor may be the murder weapon." I turned the page and let the words filter through me like a fog I wasn't eager to enter. The coroner had done his job, as coroners do, catalogued bruises, measured angles, recorded the last indignities in clean prose. The ligature was consistent with Florist's twine. A single knot behind the right ear, pulled tight. No signs of restraint. No defensive wounds. And then the detail that made me sit up. Pinned to the left breast of the blouse was a silver lily. Ornamental, filigreed, no puncture wounds beneath. "Pinned afterward," I said. "Of course," Wolfe murmured. "She wasn't resisting," I added. "Or she knew the person." "She knew them," Wolfe said, "or believed she did. Trust is not always the truth. In many cases it is the most effective disguise. The pin wasn't just jewelry, it was punctuation. Whoever did it wanted to make a point. And if I knew Wolfe, he was already trying to read it." Wolfe remained still. That might sound unremarkable, he often did. But this was different. He didn't breathe through his nose. He didn't shift a finger. Just silence, taut and elongated like the pause before a conductor lifts the baton. Then finally, "They arranged her." That was Wolfe's word, arranged, and coming from him, it meant more than posture. It was about intention, composition, meaning. This was not an act of concealment, he went on, not merely disposal. This was a message, a composition. As one would leave a bouquet, I said nothing. For once there was nothing to say. "She was displayed," Wolfe continued, with something approaching reverence, as if the killer still needed her to speak for them one last time. I didn't correct him, though part of me wanted to. Coral hadn't spoken, she'd been silenced, but I knew what he meant. Whoever did it hadn't wanted her gone, they'd wanted her seen. One final statement, on burlap, with a lily for signature. Finanella came back that afternoon, eyes red, hands buried in the sleeves of a coat that made her look like she'd folded herself in half and was trying not to spill. "She's dead," she said, though we hadn't told her. Wolfe inclined his head. "Yes." "I knew it when I saw the newsstand," she murmured. "The word florist, that was enough." He waited. So did I. There was a man, she said finally. A client. His name was Arthur Langford. He came in late, always alone. Coral handled him personally. Wolfe said nothing. He said she destroyed his marriage, Finanella went on. That the bouquet she'd made for their anniversary carried a hidden message. White camellias. Rue, he said it was a curse. And was it? I asked. She didn't deny it, Finanella whispered. She just said he'd asked for truth and she gave it to him. A fatal dose, evidently, Wolfe murmured. No, Finanella said, eyes burning. His wife took that. He only swallowed the guilt. Wolfe closed his eyes, not in pity, but in recognition. Even beauty, weaponized, must find a target. Langford. The name was familiar. Wolfe, of course, remembered exactly where from. He pulled the ledger, Coral's commission book, and ran his finger down a column of florals, like they were lines of poetry he didn't particularly enjoy reciting. Arthur Langford, he said. 2 arrangements in April, 1 in June, each with coded species. Funereal, stark, emotionally aggressive, camellias, rue belladonna. You think he read into it? I asked. I think he read, Wolfe replied, and found too much of himself staring back. He leaned back. This is not a matter of delusion, it is transference. She offered not bouquets but interpretations, and her clients, guilty, grieving, or merely self-absorbed, took them as judgment. Did she mean it? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. That is the cruelest ambiguity. If she did, she was a manipulator. If not, then a mirror. Either way, I said, someone broke. Yes, Wolfe said softly. And now we must ask whether that break preceded or followed the murder. Wolfe had retreated into the chrysalis of thought he only emerged from when truth was ready to hatch. He sat still, lips pressed together, eyes fixed on the bust of Goethe above the fireplace. For him, murder was not an event, it was a sequence of psychological permissions. She was a confessor, he said finally. But she did not absolve. I nodded. She listened. She didn't forgive. And worse, he said, she reflected. She let people see themselves too clearly, through the prism of stems and petals, gestures and silences. Did she judge them? Perhaps, Wolfe said. But more likely she simply allowed their own judgment to fester. He opened his eyes. Some people can be confronted with truth. Others need only the suggestion of it to destroy themselves, or another. That's poetry, not motive. Wolfe's lips curled. In this case it may be both. And I knew then that he didn't just want to solve the murder, he wanted to understand the philosophy behind it. Wolfe sent me back to the shop to retrieve Coral's appointment book, if it still exists, as he phrased it. The place was colder now, emptier, as if the air had finally given up pretending she'd return. The desk drawer was open, not forced, opened. The ledger was gone. In its place was something worse, a single ivory card tucked under a shallow dish of withered blooms. No note, no explanation, just a printed name in old script. In loving memory of Geneva Ashcroft Valdon, 1931. I didn't need Wolfe to tell me who she was. That was Bernard Valdon's mother. And if this was a coincidence, I was ready to buy beachfront in Queens. I locked the shop behind me and walked back slowly, the card in my coat. There are messages, and there are warnings. This was neither. It was an accusation, quiet, understated, and exquisitely timed. Wolfe is not stirred easily, not by headlines, not by threats, and least of all by emotional implorings. But there are moments when something cuts through the layers of obstinacy, like a scent too sharp to ignore. That morning, it was Coral Downes's murder. This, he said, pushing his breakfast plate away, is not merely murder. It is desecration of aesthetic form, of moral order, and of professional integrity. I looked up. You mean because of the flower pin? No, Wolfe replied, because someone dared to compose death as a message. That implies authorship, not impulse. And authorship suggests a mind that believes itself just. That was Wolfe's way of admitting the game was on. You'll take the case seriously? I will prosecute it with rigor, he said, which is more than the police seem inclined to do. He issued his first directive, Arthur Langford. He is not mad, Wolfe said, but he is dangerous. There is grief in him, perhaps guilt, and certainly symbolism. I reached for my notebook. Go, he said, and bring back facts. I will tell you which ones matter. And just like that, the man who hadn't budged for 4 days had entered the case without rising from his chair. Arthur Langford answered the door himself, which was already an indication that his house had grown too large for its remaining occupants. He looked like a man whose suits had once been tailored, but now wore him. His eyes, blue, brittle, landed on me like a question he hadn't decided was worth asking. "You're from Mr. Wolfe," he said, though I hadn't introduced myself yet. "I am." "Come in." He didn't offer coffee or excuses. "I assume this is about Coral," he said. "She's dead." He nodded once, as if confirming a guess he hadn't wanted to be right about. "It was the bouquet," he said flatly. "The one she sent my wife." "White camellias?" "Yes, in odd numbers." "You think that killed her?" "I think," he said, voice tight, "it told her what I never dared to say. She took her own life." He didn't flinch. "Yes, but Coral whispered the sentence. I merely stood by while it was carried out." He said it without drama, which made it worse. It wasn't a performance. It was a verdict, handed down from a man who hadn't forgiven himself, but wasn't done blaming her either. Langford's apartment had the scent of old paper and unopened windows. He handed me a program from his wife's funeral, edges worn from the kind of repetition you don't get from fondness. Inside was a pressed camellia, white, brittle as his voice. "I found it in her dressing table," he said. "She'd kept it." "After the letter?" "What letter?" "She didn't show me, but she mentioned it. Coral sent it after the bouquet, said it was symbolic." He sat back, eyes distant. "She always read too much into things. Coral gave her the excuse." I didn't argue. You don't tug at the threads when a man's already unraveling. But it didn't sit right. Coral was a florist, not a prophet, unless, of course, she'd known what buttons she was pushing. I left with the funeral program and the distinct impression that guilt wears many disguises, grief, obsession, and, in Langford's case, a polished quiet that didn't answer half the questions it raised. Valdon's estate had a greenhouse, of course. It sat at the back of the property like an afterthought of elegance, quiet, glassy, and far too warm for January. Bernard's man let me in without comment, and I took my time. Inside was not a showroom, it was a reliquary. Dozens of dried arrangements, each tagged in Coral's narrow, exact script. Not client tags, personal ones. Some were sealed between glass sheets, others were pinned like butterflies to mounting boards. A museum of moments that had outlived their emotion. There were no roses, not a single one. Instead, marigolds, hyacinth, belladonna, sprigs of rue wrapped in silk cord. One bouquet had been scorched at the edge, as if someone had considered burning it and then lost their nerve. I'd seen Wolfe catalogue orchids with the same reverence. But this wasn't botany. This was something darker. Coral hadn't just arranged beauty, she'd preserved meanings. And here they hadn't been tossed, they'd been curated. Whatever Coral was to Bernard Valdon, she hadn't been a secret. She'd been a message, one he was still storing. One bouquet sat apart from the rest. Pressed into a wooden frame, under glass that had been recently cleaned, it bore a short inscription in Coral's hand. "Forget me, but not entirely." I read it twice because it didn't sound like a plea, it sounded like a condition. The flowers were forget-me-nots, of course, but dried into a pale shadow of themselves, held together by a faded blue ribbon. No client tag, no date. Who was it for? Bernard, Langford, or someone else? Someone she couldn't name without consequences. I jotted the phrase in my notebook and studied the frame again. There were no initials, no marks, just Coral's script, and that half-sorrowful, half-threatening turn of phrase. Wolfe says that language is a precision tool. Coral used it like a scalpel, and this bouquet was a wound, someone hadn't let close. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence says enough, especially when it's preserved under glass and titled like a warning. It broke that afternoon. Kramer called. He sounded simultaneously triumphant and annoyed, which usually means something messy has landed on someone else's carpet. "We got him," he barked. "Emory." "The manager?" "Howard Emory, Coral's ex-fiancé. A cleaning woman found a scarf, her scarf, in the back closet of the shop, monogrammed, blood at the corner." "You believe it?" He paused. "It fits." That wasn't a yes. I went down to the precinct. Emory looked pale, cornered, and insulted. His hands shook, but not from guilt, more like rage without a spigot. "I didn't kill her," he said. "And that scarf wasn't in the closet last week?" "I checked." "Why were you checking?" "Because I knew something was wrong. Coral would have fired me if she thought I was snooping." "Then who planted it?" "I don't know." His voice cracked. "But I loved her, even after she stopped loving me." That wasn't exoneration, but it wasn't confession either. I left with a question mark and a file of statements Wolfe would soon dissect with surgical disdain. Back at the brownstone, he already knew. "It's too neat," he said. "The scarf, the closet, the timing. Someone's telling a story, and they want us to believe the ending before we've read the beginning." Wolfe was pacing, which by his standards means a total of 4 trips between the arch and the bookshelf, with a detour to the globe. That alone told me something was burning under the surface. "The evidence is too exact," he said, "too theatrical. A monogrammed scarf discovered days after the crime in a closet no one had touched until it was convenient to find it. Number. It is an offering, not a discovery. Planted. Emphatically, Coral Downs was not killed in a moment of panic. She was executed with care, composed. The same intelligence that arranged her body arranged the narrative." He paused. "We are not being given facts, we are being fed a fable. And the scarf. A prop, no more genuine than a stage dagger." I sat, flipping through my notes. "Then what do we need?" He stopped pacing. "The beginning," he said. "The real beginning. And where do you think that is?" He moved to the orchid room door and placed a hand on the frame. "The murderer is telling a story through petals, Mr. Goodwin, and we've missed the opening stanza." Which, knowing Wolfe, meant we were about to reread the whole book. The paper hit the stoop at 7:04. I opened the door, scooped it up, and made it 3 steps inside before the headline sent a chill through my morning that not even Fritz's coffee could thaw. "Delivery boy found strangled in Central Park. His name was there, 2nd paragraph, Toby Quinn, 19, courier for blooms and benedictions, last seen just after dusk. No witnesses, no suspects, just the grim, efficient work of hands that had known what they were doing." I brought the paper into the office. Wolfe was seated, of course, his eyes still fixed on the morning orchid misting schedule. "Toby Quinn," I said, "was found dead last night. In the park." Wolfe didn't flinch. "They found a bouquet in his bag," I added. "Addressed to you." That earned me a blink. "Describe it." "White anemones, black-scented, pale orchids, no card." He folded the paper with a precision that matched the gravity in his voice. "Then it is no longer a pattern. It is a progression." "And what exactly is progressing?" "The narrative," he said. "Coral Downs began it, and now someone is revising the ending." I brought the bouquet back myself. The officer guarding the scene was a new recruit, too green to ask why a civilian was lifting evidence in the name of a sedentary detective. Wolfe didn't need to handle it. One glance was enough. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at the ribbon. "Blue silk," he murmured, "hand-dyed, hemmed in a French seam. Coral used it only once a month." "For what?" He lifted a brow. "Private messages, exclusive clients. She believed in visual discretion." "Any idea what this one's supposed to say?" "It says it was meant for me," he replied. "And not by the boy who carried it." He didn't mean it metaphorically. He meant precisely. Wolfe never did like implication without verification. I took a closer look. The ribbon had a faint scent, ambergris and lilies, and a barely visible crease at the fold, as if a card had once been tucked inside and later removed. "Whoever killed Toby," I said, "sent this." "No," Wolfe corrected, "they used it, which is more cunning and more dangerous." We sat without speaking for a minute. Wolfe's gaze lingered on the bouquet, not with sentiment, but with professional disdain. "He was no longer a boy," he said. "Toby Quinn, 19 is an age of recklessness, but also ambition. He was a courier, yes, but not merely of flowers." "You think he was carrying something else?" "Information. Subtle, perhaps accidental. But knowledge, once acquired, always becomes dangerous in proportion to the secrets it touches." I nodded. "So this wasn't personal?" "On the contrary," Wolfe said, "it was entirely personal. Toby Quinn was not silenced for what he did, but for what he might have done or said." The logic had its usual Wolfean precision, and it tracked. Toby didn't die with a message. He died as a message. I flipped open my notebook. "So who gave him that bouquet?" Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. "Someone who wanted us to believe Coral had left us one last whisper. But it's ventriloquism, Archie. We are hearing her voice, but it is not hers." It was a short question that gave her away. I was talking with Finanella Marsh again, this time under Wolfe's instructions to observe, not interview. Sometimes you get more from listening to what someone doesn't quite say than from what they volunteer. She was describing Coral's signature style, the floral compositions, the symbolism, the care, and then she said it. She always dictated the sentiment, never liked to write them out herself, said it ruined the rhythm. "Who wrote them?" She blinked. "I did." It didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a detail she hadn't realized mattered. "You wrote all of Coral's bouquet cards?" She nodded. "Only the ones with metaphors, the riddles." She had beautiful ideas, but no ear for poetic language. "And you?" "I studied poetry at Vassar," which, as Wolfe would have said, was both too much and not enough. So Coral hadn't written the messages. Finanella had. The petals had been hers, but the words, the ones that pricked, hinted, wounded, had passed through another's pen. A poet in the shop, a cipher at the desk. The question wasn't whether Finanella knew the codes, it was whether she'd ever stopped using them. Back at the brownstone, I relayed the revelation. Wolfe closed his eyes and tapped his thumb once against the armrest. "She wrote the metaphors," I said. "All of them." "Then the weapon was not Coral's." "You think Finanella composed the threats?" "I think she composed the possibilities," Wolfe said. "Coral applied them, perhaps carelessly, perhaps cruelly, but the substance originated in the writer." I asked for permission to press Finanella. He gave it with a grunt. She didn't deny it. Her voice was brittle, but her spine was straight. "I only gave shape to Coral's instincts," she said. "She told me what she wanted to say. I found the words. And if she wanted to say nothing, then I said nothing. But the bouquet that killed Langford's wife, the arrangement meant for Wolfe, those had words once, words that vanished, cards that were removed. Coral trusted me," she said finally. I didn't reply. Wolfe always said, "Trust is the comfort of those with something to lose." And I had begun to suspect Finanella had already lost more than she was ready to admit. I returned to the shop with a screwdriver and a bad feeling. Coral's workroom hadn't changed. The scent of eucalyptus still lingered, and a half-tied ribbon curled like an afterthought on the counter. I started with the drawers. Nothing in the main compartment, nothing behind the files. But the third drawer on the right didn't sit flush. I removed it, reached behind, and felt resistance. Thin, lacquered wood. I pried gently. Behind the false bottom was a leather-bound book the color of old cinnamon, unmarked, untitled, coded. Inside, page after page of flowers, drawings, Latin names, shorthand notes, and next to each, a name. Valdon, Langford, Emory, dozens of others, Not deliveries, not sales, confidences. Every page was a transaction, a message coded in bloom, handed off without a trace, until now. I slipped it into my coat. Wolfe didn't need theatrics. He needed fact. This was fact, dry, pressed, and damning. Back at the brownstone, I placed it on his desk like a relic from a ruined altar. His eyes didn't move from the page, but his hand opened for the next. He read without speaking, line by line, name by name, until the bouquet meant for him appeared in the ledger: anemone, ghost orchid, belladonna, and next to it, in Coral's hand, or Finella's, N.W. Confidential. No card. He turned the page, then turned back. Hyacinth, iris, bluebell, he murmured. I raised an eyebrow. 3 flowers, Wolfe said, each with an encoded meaning known to students of Victorian botany. Hyacinth, love. Iris, truth. Bluebell, silence. And together? Blackmail, he said softly. 3 motives, bound by a ribbon and delivered as a warning. To whom? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Whoever had killed Coral had not acted in rage. They had acted in reply. And now, Toby, the boy who delivered meaning, was dead. I leaned back, notebook open but suddenly irrelevant. Wolfe closed the book, fingers steepled. She was blackmailing them, Archie, 1 bloom at a time. You'd think a man who's been blackmailed, threatened, or otherwise danced around the edge of murder might show a little gratitude when someone offers him a seat in a temperature-controlled room with Persian rugs and imported beer nuts. But no, our guests arrived as if summoned by subpoena and not by Wolfe's cordial invitation, which I had personally delivered with the smile of a choir boy and the persistence of an IRS auditor. The lineup wasn't a bad cross-section of guilt and grooming. Bernard Valdon, sleek as an oil painting in a French museum. Finanella Marsh, pale, poised, and harder to read than a banker's diary. Arthur Langford, looking like he'd aged a decade in a week. And Howard Emory, whose eyes now carried the jitter of a man who'd opened 1 closet too many. In the corner, Inspector Kramer sat with the expression of a man forced to attend a wedding where his ex was the bride. He muttered something about being press-ganged into a parlour game, but didn't leave. Wolfe inclined his head, laced his fingers on his considerable girth, and began, not with accusation, but with instruction. As always, the stage was his. The rest of us were just actors fumbling for our cues. Wolfe didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. When he spoke, it wasn't oration, it was inevitability. There exists, he said, a lexicon as old as deceit and more elegant than ink, the language of flowers. Kramer rolled his eyes and made a noise like he was allergic to begonias, but Wolfe ignored him. Floriography, he continued, reached its florid height in the Victorian era, when courtship and condemnation were conducted without a syllable spoken. Hyacinths for love, rue for regret, bluebells for silence. Every petal had meaning, every bouquet a sentence. He paused just long enough to let the silence ripen. I have here a volume, he lifted the leather-bound manual like a priest with a catechism, compiled in 1872. It was Coral Down's constant reference, and from it she composed not merely arrangements, but intent. Langford shifted. Finella's hands twisted lightly in her lap. Bernard blinked. Emory stared at the floor like it owed him something. And when intent is veiled in art, Wolfe concluded, it does not lessen its weight, it merely changes the method of delivery. The message had been sent. Now it was time to see who dared receive it. Wolfe didn't accuse, he revealed. Slowly, methodically, with the weight of inevitability in every syllable. You each received flowers, he said, but not for fragrance or festivity. He gestured to a sheet on his desk, a pale, precise inventory. Mr. Emory received camellias and rue, unfaithfulness and sorrow. Mr. Langford, a nosegay of white hemlock and iris, poison and truth. And Miss Marsh, a cascade of foxglove and marigold, insincerity and grief. Finanella opened her mouth, then shut it again. Bernard said nothing. Langford's jaw tightened. They were not bouquets, Wolfe continued. They were statements, artful, ambiguous, yet unambiguously intimate. I watched them. 4 suspects, seated as if waiting for judgment, their alibis wilting like stems in sun. Wolfe's tone remained mild, almost indulgent. He might have been explaining how to cook pheasant with vermouth. Coral Downs trafficked in emotion, he said. But she also traded in secrets. She did not blackmail with words, she implied, and in doing so she left room for the guilty to breathe until they couldn't. He looked to Kramer. Inspector, I submit that motive is no longer abstract. It is tangible, pressed between petals. Kramer nodded once. The room, however, remained mute, except for Wolfe, who never needed applause to deliver an aria. Wolfe reached for an envelope with the deliberation of a man selecting dessert. He opened it and unfolded 2 pages, neatly typed, annotated by hand, in a feminine scrawl. Mr. Valdon, he said, your mother's death was ruled a suicide, an overdose, administered in her solarium. Your public statement suggested peace, but the truth was thornier. Bernard stiffened. He did not speak. This, Wolfe continued, is a draft of the floral order, coral prepared for the St. Remy Gala, a wreath for your mother's memory. It was to contain white narcissus, heliotrope, and aconite. I may not know my Latin, but I've spent enough time cataloguing orchids to know what that meant. Narcissus for self-love, heliotrope for devotion, aconite for death. Wolfe let the implication breathe like old wine. You paid Coral to cancel the order. I have her ledger entry crossed out and underlined. Bernard's voice, when it came, was soft and bruised. She said it wasn't extortion. She said it was elegy. Wolfe inclined his head. It was both. And that was the moment something passed over Bernard's face, neither rage nor guilt, but the hollow acknowledgement that shame, once arranged, cannot be undone. We waited, and Wolfe turned the next page. Wolfe didn't need to raise his voice to pivot the room. He merely shifted his gaze to Arthur Langford, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees. Mr. Langford, he said, your wife's death was her own, but your grief, that was someone else's currency. Langford flinched, then folded in on himself. The man looked hollowed out, like something that had been burned and dusted off. You received, 2 weeks after the interment, Wolfe continued, a bouquet of camellias and belladonna, accented with rue. You told yourself it was coincidence. Langford shook his head, not in denial, but in remembrance. Coral did not kill your wife, Wolfe said, but she made you believe she might have contributed. She nurtured the idea, she implied culpability with stems and silence, and then she offered you peace, in installments. Langford's voice was barely breath. She said it was artistic expression. Indeed, the expression of fear, obligation, and the subtle flattery of personal ruin. It was not extortion, no. It was suggestion, cultivated with care. And you paid for quiet not because you were guilty, but because she convinced you you might be. The silence that followed wasn't accusatory, it was grief, re-rooted. And Wolfe, ever the gardener of truths, let it grow a moment longer. Wolfe's attention drifted next like a beam of sunlight selecting a darker corner. It fell on Howard Emory, who sat with his legs crossed too tightly and his fists balled in his lap. Mr. Emory, Wolfe said, with the faintest tilt of the lip, I do not believe you killed Coral Downs. If relief bloomed, it did so behind the man's spectacles, too proud to show itself. What you did, Wolfe continued, was hold on. Too long. To a woman who composed with petals, not affections. Emory's throat moved like a man swallowing tacks. The scarf found in your closet was planted. Artfully, yes, but cheaply. A bouquet of deception with wilted stems. I watched Emory shift in his seat. Not guilt, something worse, irrelevance. You were not her lover, nor her enemy. You were merely a fixture, a shelf she dusted off occasionally, until you began to resent her absence. I never hurt her, Emory muttered. Wolfe inclined his head. Number U only watched her vanish, emotionally first, then utterly. The cruelest grief I've found is not from loss, but from never having owned anything at all. Wolfe allowed the silence to linger, then turned toward the empty chair. It didn't need to be filled. We all felt who it belonged to. Toby Quinn, Wolfe said almost gently, was not merely a courier. He was an observer. Kramer grunted, but Wolfe pressed on. He found Coral's records, her system, the coded ledger. Perhaps he didn't grasp its entirety, but he knew it meant something. I added, he approached someone. Maybe Emory, maybe someone else, someone who panicked. Wolfe nodded. He was not silenced because he posed a threat. He was silenced because he reminded someone of the truth. Strangled, Kramer said from his corner. Like her. Yes, Wolfe murmured, but with less reverence. Coral was arranged, posed. Toby was disposed of. There was no dramatic gasp, no finger-pointing, just the weight of a dead boy's bag, now heavier than ever. I suspect, Wolfe added, he was meant to deliver one last bouquet to me. And he did, I said. Yes, Wolfe agreed. And in doing so, he delivered the sender as well. We didn't need to name the recipient. Her silence was beginning to speak. She underestimated only one, Wolfe said, as if citing scripture. The one who knew her best. Not the men she toyed with or the clients she flattered, but the hand behind her words. Finanella Marsh had gone pale, her fingers clenched in her lap like small, ivory birds caught mid-flight. You wrote her cards, Wolfe said softly. You chose the flowers. You translated sentiment into code. You, Miss Marsh, were her instrument, and finally, her mistake. Finanella opened her mouth, then shut it. She thought she controlled the message, Wolfe went on. But the message passed through you. Each bouquet, each metaphor, she played with secrets you carried. And when she chose to break trust, when she used your own invention to manipulate someone else, something fractured. I loved her, Finanella whispered. I have no doubt, Wolfe replied. But love, when betrayed, is rarely silent. Kramer sat up straighter. Wolfe looked toward the orchids behind him, as if one might bloom with confirmation. She thought you would always be her voice, he said. She forgot you had one of your own. Finanella did not deny it. Some truths don't need volume. She didn't weep, not in the way you expect when confessions come due. There was no keening, no cinematic shudder. Finanella Marsh simply folded inward like a tulip robbed of sunlight and spoke in tones meant for glass and dust. I didn't plan it, she said. But she used the rue. Our rue Wolfe, who had once called emotion a crude lubricant of reason, did not interrupt her. For once, he let the oil flow. I wrote her words, Finanella murmured. I shaped the messages. But she started using them like knives, hiding barbs behind petals. Her eyes, when they lifted, were the color of unslept nights. She told me it was poetry, that no one else understood, but she began twisting meanings, threatening, controlling. And then one day, I saw she'd used our code against someone she claimed to protect. The boy, I said. Finanella nodded. He found the ledger. She mocked him. She laughed, said he'd never read the language. And you? Wolfe prompted gently. I wrote that language, she said. In the silence that followed, nothing bloomed, just the memory of a girl who loved metaphors and died by one. As Kramer rose to his feet and herded the living toward the law, Wolfe remained seated, motionless but not unmoved. The last word had been spoken, not by him, but by the silence Finanella left behind. He reached for a handkerchief, not to dab sweat, but to brush dust from his sleeve. No system of meaning, he said quietly, survives the contempt of its author. I stood at the edge of the orchid room, watching the light drip through green glass. There wasn't anything left to ask, just the quiet settling in, and the bouquet of consequences arranged to last. Wolfe didn't bother to rise, and no one expected him to. His chair was his throne, his platform his fortress, and from it he dispensed truth with surgical calm. "The murderer," he said, folding his hands as if he were about to recite a verse of Horace, "was Finanella Marsh." No dramatics, no protest, just the woman, upright and silent, as though she'd been expecting it. Kramer made a sound, part sigh, part disbelief, but Wolfe silenced it with a raised brow. She killed not from hatred nor fear, but from an emotion more destructive because it wears a softer mask. Love, disillusioned, betrayed, made obscene. He turned toward her, not unkindly, but without lenience. You were not Coral's servant. You were her voice, her co-author. You believed that gave you a claim. Finanella lowered her eyes. Her lips moved, but produced no sound. "Instead," Wolfe continued, "she used your authorship as weaponry. You were her lexicon, her cipher, and ultimately her pawn." No one spoke. Kramer pulled out his notepad, but didn't open it. Wolfe exhaled. She discarded the one person who translated her soul, and in doing so she authored her own elegy. The word justice was not uttered. Wolfe found the term vulgar. It would have been easier to call it blackmail, but that lacked the lyricism Wolfe demanded. "She did not merely exploit people," he said. "She appropriated meaning, Finella's meanings." He gestured toward the desk where a disassembled bouquet lay in pieces, symbols dissected, intention exposed. "Each flower in those arrangements," he said, "was not randomly chosen. They were composed, like stanzas. Finanella composed them." Finanella did not look up. Her silence was no longer protective. It was penance. Wolfe pressed on. Coral, however, discovered that the same language which could whisper affection could also hiss threat. I said, "She turned poems into invoices." Wolfe's mouth twitched approvingly. "Yes, her intimacy became extortion. What had once bound them in artistic secrecy became a ledger of leverage." Finella's voice broke the hush. "I didn't know how far she'd gone." "You did," Wolfe corrected, but not cruelly. "You just didn't want to translate what you already knew." The betrayal wasn't new. It was old, dressed in florals and denial. What Coral had stolen wasn't money or reputation. It was authorship, identity. The petals had been Finella's, but the knife, ultimately, was hers. "That night," Wolfe said, "was not premeditated, but it was inevitable." He allowed a pause, not for drama, but for clarity to settle. They argued in the shop. Finanella confronted her, not as an assistant, but as a creator scorned, and Coral, true to character, dismissed it all as sentimentality. "She laughed," Finanella murmured, not to anyone in particular. Wolfe inclined his head. "She did. And she told you what? That you were nothing without her? That your words meant only what she allowed?" Finella's hands were steady now. There was no need to shake. "I told her I would stop writing for her," she said. "She said I never wrote at all." "That," Wolfe said with a quiet nod, "was the moment. She turned her back, perhaps to lock the drawer, perhaps to retrieve another ribbon." "And I—" Finanella swallowed. The shears were there. There was no gasp, just a faint stiffening in Kramer's jaw. "You did not intend it," Wolfe said, "but you crossed it nonetheless." A ribbon, red as the consequence, had bound the night shut. Not every poem ends with punctuation. Some close with silence. "Toby Quinn," Wolfe said, "was the only true innocent." He didn't romanticize the boy. Wolfe never romanticized anything that could bleed. "But he found the ledger," I said. "Yes." "And misjudged it." Wolfe steepled his fingers. He thought it was currency, something he could trade. Perhaps for recognition, perhaps for cash. Finella's voice was barely audible. He was proud of it. "He was a child," Wolfe replied flatly. "Pride is dangerous in children, especially when it stumbles upon weapons." She looked up. Her eyes weren't pleading. They were resigned. "He threatened to expose it," she said. "Not to the police, just to someone." Someone like Bernard Valdon, I offered. Or worse, Wolfe said. A journalist, a rival? Anyone who might make Coral a spectacle. And by extension, Finanella. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. I followed him, she said. I asked him to give it back. He wouldn't. He was strangled, Kramer interjected, voice low. With the same ribbon, Wolfe confirmed. The symbol of secrecy and the tool of silencing. In a world of language, Toby had misread the lexicon, and in doing so, invited its cruelest editor. Kramer stood like a man being forced to pull up a tree with one hand. He didn't protest. He didn't delay. He walked to Finanella, pulled the cuffs from his coat pocket and muttered, Miss Marsh, you'll come with me. She did, without tears, without words. Kramer didn't look at Wolfe. He looked at me, and what he said was unexpected. I hope your orchids bloom, Archie. Wolfe, predictably, took no notice. He was already turned toward the window, his thoughts more botanical than judicial. Bernard Valdon remained behind a moment longer. He was the last to leave, deliberate, slow, careful not to be looked at. I followed him to the door, but he didn't turn. She had leverage on you too, I said. He paused. I've paid for that already, he replied. Every night. The door clicked shut. Sometimes guilt isn't in what you did, it's in what you allowed, and Bernard, for all his inherited grace, would carry the scent of those blossoms forever. Wolfe was in the plant room when I returned, though technically he never left it. The world might burn to ash, and he'd still be feeding orchids in alphabetical rotation. I walked in, set a single white rose on his desk, and didn't say a word. He glanced at it once. You know I detest symbolic gestures. It's not a symbol, I said. It's a flower. He resumed tending to a Miltonia hybrid that hadn't bloomed in 3 years but was beginning to consider the possibility. There wasn't much else to do. The murder had been solved, the motive laid bare, the guilty escorted. But the residue remained. The brownstone was intact, but not untouched. You think she'll plead? I asked. I think, Wolfe replied, that she's already sentenced herself and that no court will match the thoroughness of her own conscience. I didn't argue. Some crimes don't need gavel and bench. They need solitude and mirrors and a silence that grows teeth. The rose stayed on the desk. It was neither condemned nor praised. It was simply there, like all things that outlast those who named them. You'd think I'd get used to it, the hush that follows the finale. The chair pushed back, the coffee cooling untouched, the page closed. But each time it feels different, not dramatic, just heavier. Wolfe was done talking, that was certain. He had returned to the ferns with the concentration of a man who considers chlorophyll superior to conversation. I stayed at the desk, eyeing the white rose I'd placed there earlier. It hadn't wilted yet. You can spend your life arranging things, flowers, words, emotions, and still have them betray you. Coral had done that with style. Finanella had done it with silence. Love had been present in all this. Not the soft kind you write songs about, the rigid, clawed kind that grips too hard and refuses to let go even when what it holds is already gone. I said, mostly to myself, some flowers are better left unarranged. Wolfe didn't answer, but the orchids shifted slightly like they'd heard me. Not every bouquet is a gift. Some are farewells with thorns. She wrote with flowers, but in the end, it was silence that spoke loudest. A heart bruised by devotion, a boy too young to measure danger, and a code meant for love turned to leverage. Each left their trace, as delicate and dangerous as perfume on parchment. Wolfe named the truth, not with triumph, but with weary precision, and I watched as the petals of deception finally wilted in the light. Do you believe love can justify a lie, or must even beauty answer to truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.